Welcome in, everybody, to another deep dive. You guys sent us a fantastic autobiography this time, Angela Merkel's Freedom. And
Yeah,
it's quite a story we're going to be looking at here.
quite a life. Yeah.
I mean, talking about a life that began in communist East Germany and then goes all the way through to becoming the most powerful woman in a reunified Germany.
Yeah,
That's pretty amazing.
it is.
And I'm really curious to dive into how those early experiences shaped her worldview and her political career.
Yeah, and that's what's really interesting about the book is that right from the beginning, she emphasizes that, her time in East Germany, it wasn't just some separate chapter.
Hmm.
She sees it as the foundation for her later political choices and her successes.
So it's not just two worlds, one life, but it's more like one life with just like a really unique perspective.
Right.
Like, think about it. Quiet life of a pastor's daughter in a small town to navigating the collapse of a state
Yeah.
and then, leading a reunified Germany on the world stage. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the book really highlights this contrast beautifully. She describes these simple everyday moments from her childhood, early morning routines, just basic breakfast.
Yeah.
And then she jumps to these high-pressure world of, international summits, and you can almost feel that weight of history on her shoulders.
I'm fascinated by the descriptions of daily life in the GDR. She mentions this class book where your parents' occupations were recorded. Sounds like a small detail, but it sounds like it carried a lot of weight.
Oh, absolutely. It was a constant reminder of your family's social standing and political reliability. In the GDR and as a pastor's daughter, she really felt this pressure to blend in, to not draw attention to her family's religious background.
She also talks about attending a Vorshilov camp. I got to admit, I'm not familiar with that. What was that like?
And essentially, it was a Soviet youth organization focused on military training and ideological indoctrination. And for Merkel, it was a very disillusioning experience. She describes the strict discipline, the meaningless tasks, and this growing sense that the socialist ideals she was being taught just didn't match up with reality.
Oh, well.
And she contrasts this with even just the small joys of life that she observed in Berlin, like people watching West German TV shows,
Yeah.
which was strictly forbidden.
It sounds like a real clash between the official narrative and what she was experiencing firsthand.
Yeah.
Did she have any opportunities to interact with the outside world?
Well, travel was restricted, but she found creative ways to learn Russian, which was crucial in the GDR. And she mentions visiting a nearby Russian estate
Oh, wow.
and spending time with the children there, practicing the language. So it's a great example of her resourcefulness and her ability to find opportunities even within this very limited system.
Yeah, I'm curious how she compares her childhood to that of her West German cousins. What stood out to her about their lives?
Yeah. Well, she envied their freedom to travel, the abundance of goods in their shops, things that were just taken for granted in the West. But it's interesting, she also notes that her relatives were fascinated by the simplicity of life in the East. The landscapes, the home-cooked meals.
Oh, wow.
It shows that even within these drastically different systems, there were things to appreciate on both sides.
Like they each had a window into a world that the other couldn't fully grasp. Makes me wonder how these early experiences influenced her worldview.
Right.
Now let's talk about her shift from physics to politics.
Yeah.
It seems like her scientific career was marked by both successes and frustrations.
Yeah, you're right. She excelled in her physics studies in Leipzig, even meeting her future husband Ulrich Merkel there, but later when she was looking for jobs. She encountered a lot of suspicion because of her religious activities. One university even turned her down, focusing more on her church attendance
Oh, wow.
than on her qualifications.
That's incredible. It really speaks to the level of scrutiny that people faced.
And the GDR, absolutely, yeah. Thankfully, she found a mentor in Professor Zulich at the Academy of Sciences in Berlin who really allowed her to flourish. But even there, she faced the limitations of the system. She loved attending international conferences, but travel was always restricted and censorship was a constant issue. She even had a postcard confiscated because it contained a quote that was deemed critical of the GDR.
It seems like these experiences played a role in her early political awakening.
Definitely. She talks about discussing politically charged books with friends and having these lively debates at church gatherings. Church became this kind of safe space for open dialogue and dissent, something that was largely missing in other aspects of life.
Yeah.
In East Germany.
She also decided to buy a home near her hometown of Templin. Was that a difficult process?
Very much so. It was a bureaucratic nightmare, as was typical in the GDR. Even simple things like buying property involved navigating this maze of regulations and permissions. It speaks to the level of control that the state exerted over people's lives.
So by the time the Berlin Wall came down, Merkel already had this deep understanding of the limitations of a closed society.
Right.
I'm curious to hear her perspective on these monumental events.
Yeah, she sensed that change was coming. Gorbachev's reforms were sending ripples through the Eastern Bloc. She even visited Hamburg in 1989, shortly before the wall fell, and felt that the GDR system was beyond repair.
She uses this interesting metaphor to describe her life in East Germany. It was like a slalom run, navigating the obstacles of the state.
Yeah, it captures that constant maneuvering and strategic thinking required to survive and even thrive in a restrictive system. But with the wall coming down, her whole world changed. Suddenly, she had the opportunity to help shape a new future.
And that's where things get really interesting. She joins this new political party called Demokratische Aufbruch, or DA, and almost immediately becomes the spokesperson.
All right.
Talk about a crash course in politics.
It was a whirlwind. She was thrown into the deep end, navigating a rapidly changing political landscape, learning on the job. Imagine having to deal with the media party politics and the complexities of German reunification, all while trying to establish your own political identity.
And then there's the shocking revelation about Wolfgang Schnur,
Yeah.
the leader of the DA, and his past as a Stasi informer. How did she handle that?
That was a major test of her leadership, finding out that the person you're working for has been secretly collaborating. With the secret police as a huge betrayal, she had to act quickly, decisively to distance herself and the party from Schnur and regain public trust.
Yeah.
It was a defining moment.
It must have been a whirlwind of emotions and political maneuvering. Didn't she also have a memorable encounter with Helmut Kohl, the West German Chancellor at the time?
Yes, she calls it the briefcase moment. She was essentially ignored by Kohl at an event. It was a small interaction, but it really highlighted the power dynamics at play between East and West German politicians, even as reunification was underway.
It's fascinating to think about those underlying tensions
Mm-hmm.
and how they must have shaped her early political experiences.
Yeah.
So with the wall down and the reunification process in full swing, she's elected to the Bundestag. What were some of the immediate challenges that she faced in this new role?
Well, the sheer speed of reunification itself was a challenge. Decisions were being made quickly, often without much input from East German representatives. Plus, she saw the struggles of the former East German economy firsthand, especially in her constituency, which included the struggling shipyard in Stralsund.
It sounds like she was entering a whole new world with a lot to learn and a lot at stake.
Absolutely. And we'll pick up on that in part 2, exploring how she navigates these challenges and rises through the ranks of the CDU.
Okay, so we'll see you back here in just a minute.
Sounds good. So as Merkel's political career kind of unfolds, we see how those experiences in East Germany really come into play. You know, she brings this unique perspective to the challenges of a reunified Germany, particularly when she's appointed Minister for Women and Youth.
It's her first major cabinet position.
Yeah.
And you can tell she's ready to tackle some tough issues.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that while many were focused on the practical aspects of rebuilding, infrastructure, the economy,
Right.
she saw the need to address the social and emotional consequences of the GDR's collapse, especially for young people.
Yeah, it's a side of reunification that often gets overlooked. You know, she understood that simply providing jobs and apprenticeships wasn't enough. You know, young people needed guidance, a sense of purpose, a chance to find their place in this new Germany.
She even mentions pushing back against some in her own party. CDU-CSU, who didn't see youth support as a priority. What was their reasoning?
Well, some saw it as an unnecessary expense. Others felt it was too focused on the past. But Merkel was adamant. She argued that investing in young people was an investment in the future of a unified Germany. It shows her tenacity and her ability to fight for what she believes in, even within her own party.
She also had to confront the very real issue of right-wing violence, which was on the rise in the early 90s. The Rostock-Lichtenhagen riots, where mobs attacked asylum seekers and Vietnamese contract workers, were a particularly horrifying example.
Yeah, those riots were a real wake-up call for Germany. They forced people to confront the ugly realities of xenophobia and racism that were still present. Even after reunification, Merkel responded with an action program pouring millions of marks into social work and violence prevention initiatives.
It sounds like she recognized that this wasn't just about reacting to the violence, but trying to prevent it from happening again. Did she continue advocating for women's rights during this time?
Absolutely. It was a consistent thread throughout her career. She was a strong voice in the debate surrounding Section 218, the law governing abortion in Germany.
I can imagine it touches on these deeply held beliefs and values. How did she navigate that?
Well, she was committed to expanding women's rights and reproductive freedom. But she also understood the realities of coalition politics and the need to find compromise.
Mm.
She was always looking for ways to make progress, even if it meant taking smaller steps.
She also had a pretty profound experience visiting Chernobyl years after the nuclear disaster.
That visit had a deep impact on her. It brought home the emotional and psychological consequences of such disasters. Even in a country like Germany, where nuclear safety standards were much higher, it gave her this firsthand look at the long-term effects and the human cost.
It seems like she's constantly absorbing these experiences
Yeah,
and applying them to her work.
yeah.
Her next role as environment minister put her on the global stage.
And this is where her scientific background really comes into play. She leads the very first climate conference, COP1 in Berlin, bringing together representatives from almost 200 countries. Talk about a high-pressure situation.
I can only imagine that the negotiations were intense. Were there any specific moments that stood out to you?
Well, she mentions this tense standoff with the U.S. delegation over emission reduction targets. It was a real test of her diplomatic skills. She knew what she wanted to achieve. But she also had to be realistic about what was achievable, considering the various political and economic interests at play.
It sounds like she had to be strategic, finding ways to build consensus without compromising her goals.
Exactly. She calls it expectation management. She was always looking ahead, thinking about the long game. And this approach really shines through in her leadership at the G8 summit, where she pushed hard for climate commitments from world leaders.
She even wrote a book, The Environment: Data, Analysis, Actions. It seems like she was determined to elevate the conversation around environmental issues.
It's a testament to her belief in the power of informed decision-making. She's not just advocating for policies, she's laying out the evidence, the data to support her arguments.
So we've seen her tackle social issues, take on a global leadership role, but then comes the coal donation scandal,
Yep.
which throws the CDU into chaos.
Yeah.
How did she handle this crisis?
This was a turning point in her career. Helmut Kohl, a giant of German politics, is brought down by this scandal. It left this huge power vacuum in the CDU. Many saw it as a time of uncertainty, but Merkel saw an opportunity.
An opportunity for what?
An opportunity for change, for new leadership. She steps up, takes the reins of the party, and starts to chart a new course. It was a bold move, considering she was still relatively new to the national stage.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The 2002 election was a tough loss for her. She ended up ceding the candidacy for chancellor to Edmund Stoiber from the CSU.
It was a strategic decision, but it also reflects the complex power dynamics within the CDU-CSU alliance. Some saw it as a sign of weakness, but others saw it as a calculated move to preserve her position within the party and prepare for a future run.
That makes sense. It must have been a difficult decision to make, especially with the pressure of a national election. How did she react to the law?
Well, she doesn't dwell on it in the book, but you get the sense that it was a learning experience. She talks about the importance of building alliances, of understanding the motivations and leverage points, of different factions within the party. It's a skill that she honed during those early years and continued to refine throughout her career.
So despite the setback, she continues to build her profile, solidify her position within the CDU, and eventually, in 2005, she becomes Chancellor of Germany. It's a remarkable ascent.
It is.
But what strikes me is that even in that moment of victory, she doesn't seem overly celebratory.
You're right, she doesn't describe it as this moment of pure elation. Instead, she talks about the immense pressure she felt, the weight of responsibility that came with this historic role.
It sounds like she was very aware of the challenges ahead.
Absolutely, and she gets right down to business.
Yeah.
Forming her government, establishing routines, and defining her communication strategy. It's fascinating to see how she approaches the practical aspects of leadership.
What stands out to you about her leadership style during those early years as chancellor?
Well, she's very methodical, analytical. She dives into the details, seeks out expert advice, and weighs her options carefully. She also recognizes the importance of clear communication both within her government and with the public. She establishes these regular chancellery rounds where she meets with key ministers and advisors to discuss policy and strategy.
It sounds like she's creating a structure, a system, to manage the complexities of leading a country.
Exactly. She's not afraid to delegate, but she also maintains a firm grip on the overall direction. And it's not long before she's tested on the global stage. The 2008 financial crisis hits. And suddenly she's at the forefront of coordinating international responses with the G20.
That must have been incredibly stressful. How did she handle that crisis?
Well, she's very candid about her dislike for having to bail out banks, but she justifies it as a necessary evil to prevent a complete economic meltdown. She saw it as her responsibility to protect the German economy, even if it meant making unpopular decisions.
It sounds like a classic example of her pragmatic approach. She's willing to do what needs to be done, even if it's not ideal. And then, of course, there's the ongoing challenge of climate change.
Climate change was a constant theme throughout her chancellorship. She was a strong advocate for international cooperation and pushed for ambitious goals in global climate agreements. But she also faced resistance, particularly from countries like the US and China.
It's interesting how her personal history seems to inform her approach to these global challenges. Having lived through the division of Germany, she understands the importance of diplomacy and cooperation.
You're right. She's also not afraid to stand up for her principles, even when it means clashing with powerful leaders. There's a great anecdote in the book about an encounter with Putin at the G8 summit in Heiligendamm. They were discussing climate change, and Putin, in his typical style, was trying to downplay the issue and resist any binding commitments.
I'm intrigued what happened.
Merkel, who's known for her calm demeanor, finally had enough. She basically told Putin in no uncertain terms that his arguments were unacceptable and that she wouldn't back down.
Wow.
It was a rare glimpse of her fiery side, and it apparently left Putin quite surprised.
It sounds like a real clash of personalities. But it also shows that she's not afraid to hold her own, even with someone like Putin.
Right.
It seems like we're about to enter some even more turbulent times as we move into the second half of Merkel's time as chancellor.
Indeed, the Eurozone crisis, the Ukraine crisis, the refugee crisis, these are defining moments that will test her leadership like never before. So as we kind of get into the latter part of her chancellorship, it feels like the stakes get even higher. The Eurozone crisis hits, and suddenly she's grappling with this possibility of a currency collapse.
The Eurozone crisis? I mean, gosh.
It was a perfect storm of economic woes and political tension, countries like Greece on the brink of default. And there's this immense pressure to find a solution that would preserve the euro. It was a high-stakes game of brinkmanship and negotiation.
And Merkel is right at the center of it all.
It sounds incredibly complex. How did she approach this crisis?
She was committed to saving the euro, seeing it as this symbol of European unity and stability. But she also insisted on fiscal discipline, arguing that bailouts should come with these strict conditions. And reforms, it was a tough stance. That earned her both praise and criticism.
She was often accused of being too rigid, too focused on austerity measures. How did she respond to that?
Well, she defended her approach, arguing that it was necessary to prevent moral hazard and ensure the long-term health of the Eurozone. But it's clear that the crisis took a toll, both on her personally and on her political standing.
Then there's the Ukraine crisis, which erupts in 2014. Given her background, I imagine she brought a very unique perspective to this conflict.
Absolutely. Having grown up in East Germany, she understood the complexities of dealing with Russia and the historical sensitivities involved. She was a strong advocate for diplomacy, pushing for dialogue and de-escalation. But she also had to deal with Putin, who, as we've seen, can be a formidable adversary. How did she navigate that relationship?
It was this delicate balancing act, She maintained open lines of communication with Putin, recognizing the need for dialogue, but she also stood firm on her principles. She condemned Russia's annexation of Crimea, supported sanctions, while also pushing for a diplomatic solution through the Normandy format.
For those who aren't familiar, what exactly is the Normandy format?
It's a four-country format involving Germany, France, Ukraine, and Russia, aimed at finding a peaceful resolution to the conflict in eastern Ukraine. It led to the Minsk agreements, which unfortunately have been very difficult to implement.
It sounds incredibly frustrating. Did she ever express a sense of disillusionment or disappointment with Putin?
You can sense her frustration at times, especially when agreements are broken or promises are not kept. But she never gives up on the possibility of dialogue, even when things look bleak.
And then in 2015, Europe faces another crisis, the refugee crisis. Thousands of people are fleeing war and persecution, seeking asylum in Europe. This was a defining moment for Merkel, wasn't it?
It was a turning point in her chancellorship. She made this decision to open Germany's borders to refugees, famously saying, "Wir schaffen das, we can do this." It was a bold move, driven by both humanitarian concerns and this belief in Germany's capacity to help.
But it also sparked a lot of controversy, both within Germany and across Europe. How did she respond to that criticism?
Well, she acknowledged the challenges, the logistical difficulties, the potential strain on social systems, but she also appealed to Germany's values, arguing that it was their moral obligation to offer refuge to those in need.
It was a decision that divided public opinion. and had a significant impact on German politics.
Yeah.
What were the long-term consequences of that decision?
Well, it's a complex legacy. On one hand, it solidified her image as this humanitarian leader, someone willing to take a stand on principle. But on the other hand, it also fueled anti-immigrant sentiment and contributed to the rise of right-wing populist parties in Germany and across Europe.
It's a reminder that even the most well-intentioned decisions can have unintended consequences.
Yeah.
As she's approaching the end of her time in office, Merkel faces one final unexpected crisis: the COVID-19 pandemic.
The pandemic was a global shock, unlike anything she'd encountered before. She responded with a mix of caution and decisiveness, implementing lockdowns and other measures to contain the virus. But she also faced criticism for the slow rollout of vaccines and the economic impact of lockdown.
It was a challenging time for all world leaders. How do you think she handled it overall?
Well, I think she navigated it as well as could be expected. Given the unprecedented nature of the crisis, she relied on her scientific background, sought expert advice, and communicated clearly with the public.
And then comes her farewell. She steps down from the CDU leadership, prepares to leave politics. Her final military tattoo is a really poignant moment, isn't it?
It's a beautiful ceremony full of symbolism. And the music she chooses is very telling. Nina Hogan, Hildegard Neff, a traditional hymn. It reflects the different facets of her personality, her East German roots, her love of culture, her faith.
It seems like such a fitting end to a remarkable career. So,
It is.
as we wrap up our deep dive into the life of Angela Merkel, what stands out to you? What is her legacy?
Well, her legacy is complex and multifaceted. She's been praised for her steady leadership, her analytical mind, her commitment to diplomacy. She's also been criticized for her pragmatism, her cautious approach, her sometimes inflexible stance.
She's certainly a figure who inspires strong opinions, both positive and negative.
Yeah, but one thing is clear. She's left an indelible mark on Germany, on Europe, and on the world. Her story is a testament to the power of perseverance, the importance of clear thinking, and the enduring value of public service.
It's a story that I think will continue to be debated and analyzed for years to come. It certainly leaves us with a lot to think about. Until next time, keep diving.